Hello, can everyone hear me? Hi everybody, nice to see you. My name is Henri. I'm the head of ecosystem at the Starknet Foundation. We're the entity who is growing the ecosystem of Starknet, which is a Bitcoin and Ethereum L2. And today I'm going to talk about how we plan on being a Bitcoin and Ethereum L2. I'm going to talk about a potential design for settling a rollup on two different chains. I want to preface this presentation by saying that this is by no means a fixed design. I'm not presenting a decision or a proper fixed technical roadmap. I'm proposing a thought experiment and a potential scenario of what could be. There are better designs that could exist, albeit they would be more complex. But these are out of scope for today, right? All right, so how do we go about it, right? I'm going to talk today about three different things. If the clicker works, it doesn't. What do I do? I can dance, but that's not going to show nicely on screen. The clicker doesn't work, guys. I need to move slide. All right. What do you want me to talk about in the middle? Well, you know what? I'll talk about the slides, and you'll get it. You'll get the slide in a minute. I'm gonna go about it in three different steps, right? Why, what, how. I'm gonna talk about why we would want this to happen. Awesome. Why we would want this to happen. Why is this interesting to potentially have a roll-up that settles on two chains? I'm gonna talk about what a potential design would look like. And I'm going to talk about how we could get there and how we actually plan on getting there. Thank you. There you have it. Okay, so let's start with why. Why does it make sense, and why would it be interesting to have a roll-up settling on two different chains? So I'll start with a small definition first, which is the difference between settling on a chain and bridging to a chain, right? Settling on a chain is a very different act than bridging between chains. Settling really means that your rollup, your chain, will prove its state transition to another chain, and it will take the reaction of that L1, of that other chains to which you're settling, into consideration for how it moves its block forward, right? So the rollup gets its state affected by the reaction of the chain it is settling on, right? This is different to bridging. In bridging, when you bridge, you prove state transitions from one chain to the other, but this is usually done through smart contracts or different mechanism, but the bridge can fail without the consensus of the rollup or without the consensus of either chain being affected, right? A bridge can fail and the rollup can keep going on, whereas when you're settling it's deeper, right? There's it really means something for the consensus of the chain and for the security of the assets. Who really cares about this, right? I mean, does this make a difference? There's bridges everywhere today and people tend to use it, and that's true. There's a lot of demand for bridges, but we can see empirically that there's also a lot of demand for settling, right? There's a demand for security. We can see it in two ways. First of all, talk to people out there. Ask them whether they care about Ethereum security. Ask them whether they're comfortable using an L2, a secure L2, or just a random sidechain or another chain altogether. You can see also empirically that people care about settlement. They care about inheriting the security of the L1 they like most, because most of the liquidity, both on Ethereum and Bitcoin, doesn't move. It doesn't use bridges. It doesn't go through L2s because L2s are still not secure enough for them. So that is a really interesting thing to see, and not all communities care about this. There are other blockchains out there who are very comfortable with bridging, but in general, Bitcoiners and Ethereans care about the security of their chain. They care about the design of each of those chains, and they want their assets to be defended by this security. So it makes sense to try to accommodate both community by settling versus just bridging if you want to bring them together. So, and that's really what this thing is about, right? Creating a chain that settles on both Bitcoin and Ethereum. The goal is not to replace either chain, it's to create a space where both communities can interact without having to mix, or they can mix if they want, right? I remember somebody saying, I don't remember who it is, so apologies if I'm stealing your quote. I remember somebody saying that blockchains are for people who hate each other to interact with each other. And there's something very true in that, right? People don't trust each other, people don't want to interact with each other, but somehow they have to. They can do it through this medium. And that's a very powerful, like the power of money revolves in the network effect it has, right? And the more people use a given money, the more powerful it is because it can enable more people to interact. And that's why gold, for example, is such an interesting currency or medium of exchange, is that it literally allows nations at war to still exchange value, right? So providing a space for communities that don't trust each other to interact without having to trust each other has value. I put it this way, there's value in being the Switzerland of blockchain. There's value in providing a space where people on both sides can interact without having to trust each other. So what kind of stuff could you actually do with this, right? So the first obvious stuff, and I'm not going to get too deep into that, though it's an interesting topic, right, is that this, having a rollup that settles on both Bitcoin and Ethereum, first of all, enables Bitcoin DeFi. I'm pretty sure people, like, let's do a short poll. Who here owns Ethereum, ETH, the asset? Quite a few people. Who here owns Bitcoin, the asset? Quite a few people also, right? So even though you may hear vocal people who really like one and really dislike the other, the reality is most of us like both because both projects are really cool, right? And probably if you like Bitcoin, there's a bunch of stuff you wish you could do with, right? And so if you add functionality on top of Bitcoin, you can do a bunch of stuff like, you know, using Bitcoin as a trustless collateral or building Bitcoin privacy protocols. There's a lot of really interesting stuff you can build once you have functionality on top of Bitcoin. The other thing you can build is you can build, for the first time, a place where you can exchange Bitcoin for ETH without a trustless middleman. Think about it for a second, right? Bitcoin and ETH are the two biggest assets in the space. And there is no way you can exchange one against the other at scale without going through a clunky peer-to-peer protocol. There is no platform where we can exchange one for the other without having to trust a middleman. How mind-blowing is this, right? This kind of design would enable that. It would enable a platform where you can exchange Bitcoin for ETH without having to trust somebody to not steal all of your funds. And then the final reason, which I think is also very valid, is why not? Yeah, you can think about why we should do it, but then the other question is why not? If you can do it, why not? What's the downside in having a network that actually enables communication between both worlds? I think it's like a lot of this industry is based on why not? Why not do it? Yeah, of course, like it is possible to do it differently, but why not, right? Okay, so I'm going to go into what this would look like, right, or what this could look like. So first, let's define like what is a dual settlement rollup? What properties would it have, right? So it should have three main properties, and I'm going to go into each one in a second: the dual finality, self-custody, and atomic composability. And it should aim to serve two categories of people. One, the maxis on either side, or regardless of the maxis, the people who are satisfied with the security of one chain, but not the other. I want an Ethereum secured rollup. You should be able to use Starknet in that case. I want a Bitcoin secured rollup. You should be able to use Starknet in that case. And then it should also allow people who are in the middle. I want to interact with both. I want to be sometimes on Bitcoin, sometimes on Ethereum, and figure out what I want. You should be able to use Starknet also. So let's go into the three properties, right? Dual finality. What does that mean? Most rollups in their current state have what is called top finality. So they get finalized once their states transitions get proven or verified on the underlying L1, and they're entirely dependent on the L1, right? So if the L1 somehow invalidates their state transition, they're totally dependent on that. That's a whole other topic. Let's not go into it. But for a dual settlement rollup, you would like to have what we call finality square, meaning it should be final on both layers. And moreover, the state transitions that are secured by each settlement layer should be consistent with one another, right? It doesn't make sense if you have block blah and black on one chain and block blow on the other. They all need to have a consistent view of the world. The second thing you need is atomic composability. You want a transaction happening on Starknet to either fail entirely or succeed entirely. It shouldn't have one part that succeeds on Ethereum and fails on Bitcoin, and vice versa. A single operation should enable people to interact with both areas, with both chains, and it's being exclusive. This is really important because you don't want to be, I don't know, exchanging your ETH for BTC only to see your ETH go away and not receiving any BTC. So either everything goes through or nothing goes through. And then the last thing is self-custody. Most people care about owning their stuff, so you should be sovereign. You should be able to walk out at any time based on the security configuration of your choosing. You should be able to access your asset, and you should be able to withdraw your money. I'm not going to go into the details of forced transactions in that context, but overall the design we're aiming for is that any state that has dual finality, you should be able to take the info that is in there, or the assets are in there, and walk out. All right, let's discuss a bit the finality square. What does it mean exactly, right? So you need a few ingredients to cook finality square. First of all, the design employs self-reference. This is a bit blurry, but at the end of the day, what this means is that the chain needs to be self-aware. Starknet needs to understand what is going on in previous block and to be able to take actions based on what happened in previous block. The second thing is that the state transitions of Starknet should be sent to each settlement layer, and the verification that happened on each settlement layer should then be verified by Starknet, which is a big difference to how rollups work today, right? Today, Starknet sends its transition to Ethereum and it assumes things work. In this design, they would need a proof that Ethereum verified the state transition and recorded it correctly. And likewise for Bitcoin, right? And then the consistency of those states needs to be verified on Starknet. There's a bit of an ever recursive loop of we need to verify the verification of the verification of the verification of the verification, but that's pretty cool. All right, so how would it work technically, right? Like this is a very simple walkthrough, and then I have a nice diagram so we can walk through it together. But basically a state update would be sent to either network. The orders of those networks here, I put Ethereum first and then Bitcoin, doesn't really matter. It can be in either order, right? But you would send a state transition, right? This is the latest block on Starknet. You send this and you verify this on Ethereum. Then you would wait for the verification that happens in a smart contract on Ethereum to be final on Ethereum. You prove that it has happened. You prove that finality has happened on Ethereum, and you use that proof on Starknet to say, hey, this is the latest state update that was sent to Ethereum. At this point, this state update can also be sent to Bitcoin. And so the latest block is sent to Bitcoin as long with the proof, and it gets verified on Bitcoin, right? And then after a while, I'm going to make a few people twitch here. After the block is final on Bitcoin, you prove that it has been verified and that it is final on Bitcoin and use that proof on Starknet. And at this stage, Starknet is aware that the same state transition has been sent to both networks. It is final, it can't be walked back. And so everything is good. And we have a new state transition. And we go again, right? The design we're looking at is slightly more elaborate than that. There's a blog post out, so do check it out. It's pretty cool. And this is a nice diagram. It shows you the happy path and the flow, the malicious path. So what happens when everything is good, right? You can see that S0 is moved to a state of pending 1. It is sent to Ethereum and to Bitcoin, and then through a light client, you send it back to Starknet. It converges on S1, and everyone's happy. And then in the overflow, you can see that both chains, Ethereum and Bitcoin, have a differing SP1 and SP2, so pending state that are conflicting. And once you've proven that there's a conflict here, both state transitions expire, and you go back to a final state of S0, right? One thing that is really important to state here is that if the malicious path happens, regardless of when this happened, as long as like if you add some money in S0, you can withdraw back to either chain you like. In any case, like you have strong guarantees that if you reach finality squared on S0, you can always access your asset, which is an important feature to have. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What about reorgs? How do we deal with reorgs? What happens if, you know, one of the chain rolls back? And if you're in the Ethereum crowd, people will say, but Bitcoin can never be final. It's always probabilistic, right? You can always walk back Bitcoin. And then if you're in the Bitcoin crowd, they will say, no, but Ethereum is just a bunch of humans coordinating. They can always change their mind. And like, that's true. There could be a state where there is, in either chain, a reorg and would need to deal with it. That's not a pleasant scenario. But the reality is, first of all, let's mention that solving for forks or reorgs in rollup is an open problem. Nobody has really solved it, and that's the same problem here, right? Let's also state that, you know, if you can prove that this happened, you want your consensus mechanism to involve some sort of slashing. But I think that at the end of the day, you know, you can say, no, but how can you resolve conflicts between Ethereum and Bitcoin? And the reality is that the biggest entities in our ecosystem deal with this problem daily. Think about centralized exchange. They have to deal with differences in finality in both chains. They have to set some threshold after which they consider that a change won't change its mind and that they're not taking risk. And it's manageable, they're doing it. So why couldn't we do it in the decentralized world, right? These are design parameters. Yes, there is risk involved. Welcome to blockchain, right? So what would happen if there is a reorg, right? Me personally, I think there are several scenarios. One is that the top rollup will choose a driving settlement layer, right? So there's a conflict between Ethereum and Bitcoin, and Starknet will say, no, we're now just a Bitcoin rollup, or no, we're now just an Ethereum rollup. I don't think that's very likely. I think what's more likely is that there will be people in Starknet who will say, no, we want it to be an Ethereum rollup. And some others will say, we want it to be a Bitcoin rollup. And then Starknet will fork. Not ideal, not unseen in our space either. And then my personal theory is that if there is a deep enough reorg to trigger that discussion in Starknet, it's very likely that this deep enough reorg will trigger that same discussion in the respective block 1 space, L1 space, right? Bitcoiners will figure, well, which chain do we choose? And Ethereans will figure, well, which chain do we choose, right? So it's more likely than not that those L1 will fork, and then Starknet will fork to follow both Bitcoin and the Ethereum fork chain, or the other one, or vice versa, right? But again, like, these are not pleasant scenarios, but they're not uncharted territories. Forks have happened in the past. All right, I'm gonna wrap up on how we get there, and then we can get some small questions. So obviously, Bitcoin is missing a few features, right? In order to have a proper rollup settling on Bitcoin, you need a few features. You need Bitcoin to have some notion of state for smart contracts. So we usually try to design these using something called covenants. I'm not gonna go into this. And second, you need Bitcoin to be able to verify a proof, right? Regardless of the design you use, you need Bitcoin to be able to secure the state transitions of the rollup. There are several designs that are really cool and really interesting. I put a couple here, look them up if you're interested. The second thing you need, I mentioned it, is you need Bitcoin and Ethereum light clients. It's not entirely trivial. There's a lot of work being done on both. And worth mentioning that if this happens, this is a net positive for both networks. Light clients are incredibly useful for both networks. So that would be a net positive for the space as a whole, even if that thing gets solved. I want to mention those two projects that are being worked on doing light clients on either chain. Then the second thing, the last thing I wanted to mention is this is going to be a gradual rollout for Starknet. It's not going to happen overnight, right? So the way we're generally going to go about it is first, we're going to get a bunch of wrapped Bitcoin assets coming natively on the network, right? So essentially a Bitcoin settlement secured by a multi-sig, not great, not bad either. You can still start building stuff. Then very likely the second design we're looking at to be rolled out on Starknet will be to secure Starknet through a BitVM bridge. Much better, still has some flaw, but much, much better. And then we're looking at the different discussions that are happening in the Bitcoin world right now on how to actually verify proof on Bitcoin. And there's a lot of a really interesting design space here. Nothing is fixed, of course, and I don't want to believe in a specific solution too much because I don't want to get my heart broken. But there's a lot of interesting discussion, so we're following that closely. And now wrapping up or rolling up. Okay, no, I'm just, this is a potential design for what a dual settlement rollup could look like. There's a lot of things we can discuss about this, but the main thing I wanted to convey is that even though this path is blurry, right? Maybe this has given you some things to think about. We're convinced that a path exists. There is a way to make this happen. We're not sure about the details, but there is a way to make this happen. And that in and of itself is crazy exciting. It is what we're in this industry for, is to be on the frontier of what is possible technically. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you. All right, I don't know that we have time for question, probably not. But you know, I'm here. I'll be at the outside, so come and talk to me. I don't bite. I mean, not in this context.